Good morning. And this week's parsha called Chukas. Uh, Parsha of Chukas spans in space and in text a number of chapters, and it goes from Numbers 19 onto a number of chapters till 21, last 21. Yeah, till 21, and it leads on to the story of Bullock. Interestingly, even though it takes over not a large number of verses, it spans in terms of speaking about events. It spans nearly the 40 years while the Jews were in Egypt. The topics span from some rules which were given right at the beginning on the in the second year, prior to them finishing the completion of the Mikdash, of the sanctuary, and it extends to the time when they're just about to go into the Holy Land. So it jumps an entire passage of some nearly 39 years, and therefore, just from a timeline perspective, it's exceptionally interesting. The name of the parsha is called Chukas. That word is derived from a meaning which means laws or statute. But the word chik has got a deeper meaning, and this is what we will talk about a little bit more. The framework of mitzvahs, the ontology of mitzvahs, can be looked at in multiple ways. One of the most simple ways is to look at it as the mitzvahs which are positive mitzvahs. That is, the mitzvahs which are basically, you shall do this and this and this. For instance, you shall bind them on your hand. That is the mitzvah of tefillin. You will put mezuzahs on your door, which are integral mitzvahs, which are mentioned within the within our main text of the Kriya Shema. There are negative mitzvahs, which basically say you shall not do. For instance, you shall not mix milk and meat when you eat. So there are mitzvahs which can be placed in the category of positive mitzvahs and negative mitzvahs. There's also a third type of category. There's also another type of category, or ontology, or method of counting mitzvahs, and that's defining mitzvahs as they are for their essential purpose. There are some mitzvahs which are called edus coming from the word testimony. They are a testimony to God's presence in the world and the miracles which they did, and the miracles which he did and were wrought for the Jewish people at the time of going out of Egypt. And Pesach can be there in that as an example, because we always talk about remembering the miracles as we go out of that were wrought that were done for the Jewish people as they came out of Egypt. There is another category, and they sanctify those period of times. There is the other ones which are special, which relate to our festivals, and so Pesach, Shavuos, and Chukas can be, in some respects, put in that category of Edus, they give testimony to God's presence in the world and what He did. There is another class of mitzvahs called mishpatim, and we actually have a full parsha called mishpatim, and they are the rules, mitzvahs, which are quite self-understood. A simple description of some mitzvah of those type of category of mitzvahs are the ones which I said are logical. For instance, if something which belongs to me does damage to my neighbor, I have to recompense him for whatever negative has been done, a negative judgment. That is to say, there is this class of mitzvahs or class of requirements which are logical nature. I need to have a judgment system. I need to have a law system that is ethical as well as correct, and allows for civilizations to groups of people to live together. So that class of mitzvahs are called mishpatim, and in English we translated them as judgments, but they are essentially logical judgments. They might have derivation from our rules in and details from the Torah, and we can derive specifics and details about them, but they in general come into a classification of the mitzvahs which can be understood. Then there is a third category. That third category is called chukim. The literal translation of the chik is a decree or a statute, laws which don't necessarily have an understanding or a logic that a human being can understand. Typical within that category is the mitzvahs of which animals are kosher, which animals are not kosher. There might be a logic which can help you understand them and the reasons behind them, but it's not defined in that reason. It's not defined by that reason. And in fact, if we go one step further, all those three classes of mitzvahs, positive, the edus, the testimonies, the mishpatim, the logic, and the chukim and the statutes, which don't necessarily have any human logic to them. In fact, all mitzvahs are really within one class. They're all required to be done, not because a human understands them, but because God commanded them to us via our Torah, via Moses, and because of that, that's why we do them. And in fact, they all become equal one to each other from that point of view. This is all God's commandments, and we do them equally with equal enthusiasm. It's quite simple that if a person understands it, a person can fulfill a mitzvah with more of his own personal input because he understands it. But they're all to be done with the same enthusiasm because this is God's given mitzvah. Interestingly, this parsha, that is this week's parsha, called Chukas, starting in chapter 19 in the book of Bamidbar. This one is called Chukas, and its beginning content, it talks about how we are required to prepare the waters, the sprinkling waters which purify us, and part of that involves the idea of finding what's called the red heifer, a calf which is perfectly red, and processes involved in it, and making the liquid which we call the purifying waters, which that is sprinkled upon the priests and any others who might have become ritually impure, and that transforms them from becoming ritually impure to pure. Now, this is not something that's understandable as a reason, but as part of the processes that the Kohanim, that the priests needed to do, and that's the topic of the beginning of this parsha. I'm not going to go into that detail at the moment, right? But what I want to show you is something something interesting, and which uses this as part of the understanding. So as I've said, as I've just going over what I just said previously, there we can look at the mitzvahs in that three, divided into three classes: the Eidos, Mishpatim, Chukim, as we just discussed, and this mitzvah of the chik is of the paraduma is of the red heifer, is one of them, the class of the mitzvahs which we are not given reasons for, and we are required to do them anyway. They're called statutes. They're called this word chukim, and that's why our parsha is called Chukas. As you read the second verse in the beginning of this parsha, Chukas, the first verse says, God tells Moses and Aaron, and he says, "I'm going to give you this following commandment." And the verse 2 starts off with saying, "These are the statutes," and when generally we understand it, these are the laws which relate to the Torah, which you are to give, which you are supposed to command the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, about. So I'm just reading the Hebrew. Meaning, these are the statutes which Hashem has commanded and given, and you have to tell the children of Israel. And then the verse goes on and says, you have to take this red heifer, etc., with all its details as it continues. Those details which relate to the head heifer. So interestingly, if you read the verse carefully, the verse says, this is the statute of the Torah which you have been commanded, and then goes on to speak about one statute. So our commentators wonder and want to know, why is this particular mitzvah called the chik of the Torah? Because if you read it literally, the verse has told you that this particular commandment you're going to hear about in the next verses is the statute of the Torah. And then if you read it that way or understand it that way, it seems to read that this particular mitzvah, it represents and stands in for all the other mitzvahs of the Torah. So if you read it literally, the verse is telling you that this particular mitzvah, the idea of preparing the red heifer and doing the work which relates to the red heifer, is as if it's the only or mitzvah of the Torah. Or if you move that idea, or if you take that idea to a further understanding, it seems that this mitzvah has an aspect about it that is a primary and important mitzvah that pervades and is assimilated and is absorbed in all the other mitzvahs of the Torah. And it acts as some sort of primary idea in the construction of all the other mitzvahs. So then our question then moves on to say, well, if that is true, or if that's the motivation or the idea that we're working on, what is it about this particular mitzvah? What detail or what aspect of it in this particular mitzvah is this ultimate driving point that we want to understand, and that drives all the other mitzvahs which are in the Torah. So with that we have to move to the more philosophical ideas that are presented in the Torah, moving beyond the basic text of the Torah, but we have to understand something much more philosophical and deeper or mystical in this mitzvah. And what is it about this particular mitzvah that drives this idea? So there must be something supra beyond the regular understanding, fundamental issue in this particular mitzvah that it is labeled the mitzvah of the Torah. So, just like I mentioned previously, as an aside, that all mitzvahs, whether they be logical ones which act as a testimony for the other mitzvahs, or ones without an apparent human logic, they're all to be done because God has commanded to us. We can take that idea and suggest that is, at first glance, and it certainly is, the fundamental aspect of the Torah, why this one is chosen, and this one, and we can say that this particular mitzvah acts as that proxy to tell us that you have to do all the commandments. So, in fact, this idea is actually hinted to by Rashi, or perhaps we can even say it's explicit in Rashi. The Rashi commentator is always there to help us to understand a much more simpler approach to the Torah, tries to understand the verses in a simple context. And Rashi tells us on the idea of Chukas Torah, because in his commentary, he quotes as a subheading just those words, "This is the statute of the Torah," which then the implication of that is to understand it as I delineated before. This mitzvah is called the primary mitzvah, or the primary mitzvah of the Torah. So Rashi then comes along and continues with his interpretation, and he says, why is this called, or this seems to be his question. So he gives an implied question. So he gives the answer saying, because the nations of the world cause and chide, cause grief to the Jewish people, and say, well, what is this commandment that you're doing? You're serving your God and you're fulfilling this commandment. What purpose does it have? It seems to be totally illogical. And in fact, without going into the details of it, there seems to be things which seem to be contradictory and not well understood. So the nations of the world make comment to the Jewish nation, why are you doing this mitzvah? And the answer is, and so the Jewish nation answers, and so Rashi answers is that that's in fact the reason why this mitzvah is prefaced with the words, this is the chik, this is the chuk, this is sois chukas Torah, this is the example and the total proxy for all other mitzvahs which are ununderstandable, and therefore we have to do that. And this is, as Rashi continues and says, this is a gezerah hu milefonai. This is a decree that I have made to the Jewish nation, and this is the decree, and therefore ein lecho reshus lahar achrecha. This is this is for you to do, rather than coming to a human understanding about it. But this is just the example which one has to be followed. Okay, so that's how Rashi, or the simple or the most straightforward understanding of this mitzvah is presented. That this is that this is the mitzvah which represents and acts as the understanding or representative of all the other mitzvahs which are in the class of chek. A more mystical approach that's presented by Chassidus to understand this mitzvah, on why this mitzvah particular is used as the example of the mitzvahs which are chukim, which are a chek, which are the ultimate of all mitzvahs. We do them because Hashem decreed them to us, and why it's so fundamental to all the mitzvahs. And if something is fundamental to all the mitzvahs, it is therefore fundamental to all of human existence and the world's physical mitzvahs. Is because this particular mitzvah, in its details, which I haven't said yet, but in its detail, it has an aspect to it which is a movement. It's not a static mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah of movement. And this is to teach us that all the commandments which we do for Hashem have to have a movement about them. And as we know, human beings wax and wane, they get enthusiastic, they get less enthusiastic. When we approach things of holiness, we are supposed to move always closer to Hashem in doing it, and we have to gather all our enthusiasm when we do mitzvahs of Hashem, and do it with a full enthusiasm. On occasions, sometimes we realize that we have to do things which involve a lot of effort, but nevertheless we gather our internal resources and do them. And in fact, this parsha comes from the last week's parsha, which we were talking about potentially, and previous parshas, where the emphasis was that we have to do physical mitzvahs. And the spiritual and just involving ourselves in the spirit and feeling good mitzvahs isn't sufficient, but we're supposed to do all of the 613 mitzvahs, which some of them are action-based. We have to do them in action. And just like we've got all the agricultural mitzvahs which relate to the land of Israel, they all involve hard, definitely hard work. But moving to another aspect, our human body, our internal existence has got an aspect of movement, just like our heart pumps blood through our body, and there is a movement of the blood going from the place of the heart to the rest of the body, and infusing the human system, the body system, with energies via the blood system, and then the blood system returns back to the heart to get infused, with oxygen, as we know that the processes of what happens on the physical realm. But our blood system gets pumped out and then returns back. So also, our service to Hashem has to be in a movement system. We have to be in a movement system of being attracted to God, and then at the same time, we have to come back. I'll just go back on those words a little bit. We have to be full of enthusiasm of doing things to God, pointing ourselves to the Spirit, looking up to the heaven, and doing things in coordinating our mind, our heart, and our actions to do service to God. So we are becoming spiritually enthusiastic. We might sing our prayers where we're getting all heated up in our mitzvahs, and then then we remember that we have to do physical things. We have to do acts of goodness and kindness. So, we might do acts of goodness and kindness to our fellow man. I'm involving myself with the world, or I have to wrap these leather straps around my hand or put these leather straps on my head, the idea of tefillin, or I've got a mezuzah and I write the writings of the Kriya Shema and have them on my doorpost. I'm involved in the physical things. That is that just like I inhale and exhale, I inhale and the movement of air into my body and the movement of my body and the air outside of my body. I'm making a movement out and a movement in, or just like the blood flows in my body from in to out. So also when I do mitzvahs, I'm 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 doing acts of which represent spirituality and making movements of spirituality from below to above. That it means from mankind and doing something spiritual and moving to the heavens, moving upwards. In the same token, by doing that movement, God sends from the heavens spiritual energies to us in a downward movement. So in in the act in the act of doing all of the 613 mitzvahs, not looking at whether they're positive or negative, or positive negative mitzvahs in the frameworks of how we can describe mitzvahs, or the mitzvahs in that three component version. All of them have an activity which basically is a movement to above and a movement to from above to below. So we have in the in our literature this as an expression called rotzo v'shev. Rotzo means literally, it means to run, and shev means to come back. This word's derived from one of the visions of the prophets when we saw the angels running and retreating. So they represent a spiritual movement of ourselves, which has been replicated in our physical life, one of constant movement of, you could call it emanation, you could call it withdrawal, you could call it expansion, or again, coming back. This is a aspect of literally of something which is alive, something which is got energies, in constant movement, and movement and progression. This is so. As I said before, we in our in the mystical realm, we call this expression rotzo, rotzo v'shev. That is a movement towards spirituality, a movement towards something more ethereal, more spiritual, and then the realization that we have to do to implement that, we have to do something physical, eat kosher food, and do something, being involved in the physical realm, it is not just simply in the spirit, but doing something more physical. So that's called the idea of Rotzer V'Shev. Ultimately, the within this particular within this particular mitzvah of the red heifer, there is an aspect which is a movement, and it represents the ultimate of this movement. In what way? part of the detail of doing the mitzvah of the red heifer and preparing this sprinkling water, as the verses tells us in chapter 19, verse number 5, tells us that the red heifer ultimately has to be totally burnt. All the entire entity of the red heifer is burnt. It's burnt to the point of absolute ashes. Those ashes are then collected, and after some ritual preparation, water is then taken and poured on those ashes. Ultimately, that water ashes combination is then used as water, which is then sprinkled on whatever article we're talking about, to take them from a state of uncleanliness to a state of cleanliness. That sprinkling of water. But let's just move that on into the idea of what happens with this red heifer. This red heifer is absolutely, totally burnt. What happens when you burn something? It gets totally consumed. What happens to the fire? The fire is always going upwards. What's left of the fire? Pure ashes. That is to say, from this view of things, from this mystical view, the red heifer is totally consumed. It rises itself, by virtue of being burnt, it rises up, and as if it goes to heaven. There's nothing left of it except ashes, which have no particular substance anymore. So also the human being, when he, inverted commas, consumes himself in the spirituality of godliness, he rises up to heaven. He's totally consumed by the spiritual aspect of it. And then when water is poured down, water comes from a high source and gets poured down to a lower source. It mixes with those ashes. So that represents the movement of God's energies to the lowest realm. And to what are those energies given to? To something which is totally doesn't have any egotistical aspect of itself. It's being totally consumed. It's totally consumed, and all it is ashes. Those two aspects, the total consumption of the person into the spirit, and then the movement from God to below, making the movement of that water, making a substance, showing that the godly spirit goes into something which is ultimately totally, with no ego, totally humble, and only and is happy, and allows itself to be consumed by God's blessings via the water. That aspect is the Rotz V'Shev, the movement of that, as we mentioned before, emanation, expansion, and then the withdrawal. That meaning, that is the flow from godliness. Those two aspects, the idea of the flow, the movement of the ash of the fire from below to above, and then the water coming down till it comes to some sort of flat, settled place. There's no longer movement of it. That is this representation that is embedded in all the mitzvahs. All the mitzvahs share this aspect of trying to move from the below to the above, and then drawing down the godly spiritual flow from above to below. So in that aspect, in that mystical understanding, is the commonality of all other mitzvahs that it shares with the mitzvah of Parah Adoma. In fact, all mitzvahs, therefore, have this aspect which is common to it, the idea of the flow from above, from below to above, and then that flow from above to below, from earth to the heavens, and the heavens back to earth, or the movement of man's spiritual energies to God, and God's answer from the heavens to man's individual life. All the mitzvahs carry that component within it, just like the human body needs the air to come in his system and then to be drawn out. So also, and also the blood system needs to constantly renew itself in the human body. So also the physical world needs the work of mankind to approach God, and the drawing down of the spirituality to man below. So this is that aspect, that commonality, that common source, which connects all the mitzvahs to this particular mitzvah called the chek, called the primary statute of the Torah. So with this, we understand the answer to the original question: why should this particular mitzvah be given the title of chek? Yes, it's true. The details are not understood, and it is from the class of mitzvahs which are the mitzvahs of statutes, which we have no human logic pertaining to it. And in truth is, and as Rashi points out and the Medrash points out, the other nations will point to us and say, what is the meaning of this mitzvah? It has no human logic to it, so why do it? So that's why this mitzvah as well is the primary example in the class of mitzvahs called chek, as a mitzvah which is not understood, but it is done by the Jews. The answer to the question of why this particular mitzvah is because this particular mitzvah in the spiritual sense, not just that it is an example of a mitzvah which is not understood by human, but has in it embedded the idea of spiritual flows of the Rotza B'Shem, the movement to the heavens and the flow of blessings from Hashem to man. And in fact, what it achieves is that when that man gets a purification process through this mitzvah, that a person who became spiritually impure by being involved with a source of defilement, and ultimately, when we learn the details of it, it refers to if you came into contact with a dead body, and that refers to the idea of something which doesn't have life in it. If a person touches something which doesn't have life into it, a person wants to move himself from that state to a state of life. This is what the dew of heaven does. The dew of heaven, the flow of heaven, turns a person from lifeless to lifeless. And in fact, in some regards, this is something that we're involved in every day, within every mitzvah. With every mitzvah, we get an extra enthusiasm and movement from doing something and getting involved with spirituality, and that gives us a spiritual life. So this particular mitzvah, this mitzvah of this, which called chayk, then talks to us and tells us that this is the this is the example that's given for all the mitzvahs of the class of chukim, as well as all the other mitzvahs. That it represents the idea of of of, of our humbleness becoming like ashes to doing things to Hashem, but going up in a fire to Hashem with our enthusiasm, fire representing enthusiasm, and Hashem responding to us with His blessings as and that those blessings becoming integrated into our world. And this is the teaching of this parsha. One of the teachings, I should say. This is one of the teachings of this parsha. The idea of Chukas, of Chayk. Okay, we'll complete this week's lesson with with this idea. Okay, have a good week. Bye for now.